And over to you, Alison.
Okay, thank you, Barney. Welcome everyone to our December webinar. As Barney said, today we're talking about carbon capture and storage, and we've got a couple of great speakers who are involved with UK projects. First speaker will be Tom Calder, who's a senior reservoir engineer with Spirit Energy, and he'll be talking about the Morecambe Net Zero Cluster Project and some of the key subsurface focus areas there. And then we'll pass over to Rodrigo Oropeza, who's my colleague at Storegga, the lead well engineer there, and he will talk a little about the Acorn project and then focus on looking at some of the well issues that are important around CCS projects, in particular legacy wells. So before we get going,
I'm just going to check. There's a couple of people on the message board have said they can't hear. I can hear you fine.
Okay.
If there are people who can hear, perhaps just pop something in the chat just to make sure that see if it's an individual thing or whether it applies to everyone. Messages. Yeah, I can. There's people saying they can hear.
Yeah.
So it might just be those individuals who can't hear. It might be worth logging back off and logging back on again, or checking your audio settings.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so just a couple of housekeeping things. If you want to know more about our speakers, they may say a little themselves, but their detailed biographies are on the event registration page. For this webinar, as with all our webinars, audience will be muted, cameras turned off, but you can use the chat function, and we encourage you to do so to ask questions as you think of them. And we will get to those at the end. Each speaker will have 15 to 20 minutes presentation, and then we'll address joint kind of questions at the end. Now, we are recording this right now. Unfortunately, we will not be recording the second presentation today. But if anyone has questions around Rodrigo's presentation and Storegga, please feel very free to get in touch with him after this session to talk more about things around his presentation, or of course ask questions at the end here as well. But if it's not answered, you can get in touch with him. So without further ado, I will pass over to Tom for the first presentation. Tom is able to share. I can stop sharing. There we go. Great.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. Is that sharing correctly?
Yep, that all looks good.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so hi everyone. As Alison mentioned, my name is Tom Calder. I'm a senior reservoir engineer at Spirit Energy based in Aberdeen. I've got about 10 years of oil and gas industry experience. So previously worked for BG Group and Shell in various locations. In the last year or so, I've been working on Spirit Energy's CCS projects. So today I'm going to be talking about our main carbon storage asset, the Morecambe Net Zero, or MNZ cluster. And the aim is to give a kind of general overview of the project and also take a closer look at some of the key subsurface elements. I will start with an apology to anyone who was at the SPE Aberdeen CCUS conference in October, because this is exactly the same presentation, but hopefully you'll be able to pick up something new and ask me some difficult questions afterwards, if so. So before diving into talking about the carbon storage project itself, I think it's important to discuss the history of the Morecambe Hub. As you can see on the map in the top right of this slide, the gas fields are located offshore UK under the East Irish Sea, which is just off the west coast of England. The water depth in the area is around 25 meters, so quite shallow compared to what we're used to in the North Sea. The hub consists of 3 producing fields, South Morecambe and North Morecambe, which make up our potential carbon storage sites, and also a more recently developed field, Rill, which is just to the north of the other 2. These fields export to the UK gas grid via the Barrow terminal, which is shown in the image on the bottom left, and this also handles some third-party production. All of these fields are still producing, and they're expected to do so for the rest of this decade. So the carbon storage project is looking quite a few years in the future. The fields and all of the associated infrastructure, so the terminal and the export gas pipeline from each field, are 100% owned by Spirit Energy. And ownership of the fields hasn't changed hands since being brought on production. So all of the historical data regarding all of the fields and the wells is fully available to us. And earlier this year, the NSTA awarded Spirit Energy a carbon storage license for this area, which you can see shaded in blue on the map on the bottom right, as part of the first UK carbon storage license round. So to help give a sense of the scale of these two fields, it's useful to look at some facts and figures around their production. The chart at the bottom of the slide shows production rate against time, with the two Morecambe fields developed during the mid-1980s and mid-1990s. Between them, they've produced over 6.5 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, which is about 185 billion cubic meters, with a combined daily rate during their peak production of over 2 billion cubic feet per day, which is around 56 million cubic meters per day. Sorry for I'm trying to cover all the bases with the units. The fields were produced seasonally during the 1990s and early 2000s, which is why you can see the sawtoothed profile on the chart. And with over 6 trillion cubic feet of gas in place, the South Morecambe field is among the biggest gas fields on the UK continental shelf. So in terms of pore volume in reservoir barrels, it's around 8 billion barrels of pore volume in the South Morecambe field. It's just quite a shallow structure. Quite importantly for our carbon storage considerations, each field is a single hydrodynamic unit, so there's no compartmentalization within the fields, and all of the wells in the production timescale can see pressure communication. Thanks to this lack of structural complexity in the fields, as well as favorable reservoir characteristics and very little water encroachment, the fields have recovery factors of over 90% and are still producing today, with production expected to continue for the rest of this decade. What this does mean is that these fields are now heavily depleted when compared to initial conditions, and the reservoir pressure of both of these fields is in the region of 100 psi, so below 10 bar. And this presents us with a huge opportunity, as well as some challenges, to repurpose these fields as high-capacity carbon storage sites. So the previous slides gave a brief overview of the history of these assets, and this slide is looking more at the future of the carbon storage cluster, which is being developed with multiple potential transport options in mind, including pipeline, ship, and rail. So emissions are expected to be available via pipeline from relatively local emitters in the Peak District area, such as the Peak Cluster, with whom we recently signed a memorandum of understanding to explore this opportunity together, and also other nearby hubs, some of which are kind of labeled on the map. Additional emission sources will be enabled via ship and rail transport. So there's a port adjacent to the Barrow gas terminal, which could be used for importing emissions via ship. And this would allow more stranded emitters access to the cluster. Depending on the transport options used, these emissions can either be delivered directly via pipeline to the storage site, or processed at the terminal before being transported offshore and injected into the fields for permanent sequestration. So yeah, the project's intended to provide an abatement solution for industries with otherwise limited emission reduction opportunities, just the nature of their industry. So the Peak Cluster is largely cement and lime production. So it's, the CO2 is more of a byproduct of the chemical process rather than due to power generation, and will help us as a country move closer to net zero and also assist in protecting jobs across the UK. So to look more closely at the subsurface characteristics of the reservoirs, a good starting point is the EU CCS directive, which was developed in 2009. And this directive established a legal framework for the environmentally safe geological storage of carbon dioxide and highlighted three principal requirements for a storage site. So capacity, sufficient CO2 storage volume, integrity, confidence that there are no significant risks of leakage, and injectivity, the ability to cope with sustained injection at industrial supply rates. And I'll go over these in a bit more detail over the next few slides. Thinking about capacity, the pyramid on the right here is a good visualization of how capacity evolves with the complexities and the maturity of the development. So the theoretical storage capacity at the base of the pyramid represents the physical limit of what the reservoir system can accept. And for depleted gas fields, this essentially assumes that the full core volume of the reservoir is available for storage. So whatever has been produced out can then be replaced with CO2. The effective capacity then takes into consideration various geological and technical cutoffs, such as water ingress and injectivity limits. The practical capacity then takes wider project factors into account, such as economics, regulatory constraints, and then match capacity at the top of the pyramid essentially considers the whole system, including identified sources of emissions at identified rates to match up the whole supply chain. For this discussion, I'll be focusing on the theoretical and the effective capacity, and also the storage efficiency, which is the percentage of your theoretical capacity that is usable after considering subsurface limitations such as water ingress. So, as mentioned, the theoretical CO2 storage capacity of depleted gas reservoirs is largely governed by how big and how depleted the fields are. In the simplest form, the intention is to replace all produced hydrocarbon gas with CO2, and the theoretical capacity of a depleted gas field can be calculated using the methodology published by Baku et al., which assumes that all produced gas is replaced by CO2, repressurizing the reservoir back to initial reservoir pressure. So in the case of the Morecambe fields, obviously they've produced huge amounts of gas, so that calculation results in a combined theoretical capacity of slightly over 1 billion tons of CO2, which is about 850 million tons in South Morecambe and just under 200 million tons in North Morecambe. So for a bit of context of what those numbers mean, the UK emitted 330 million tons of CO2 in 2022. So the theoretical capacity of these fields is the equivalent of around 3 years of current UK emissions. As always, in the world of subsurface, the reality is quite a bit more complex than this, and determining the effective capacity of the stores requires some more in-depth modeling. So using South Morecambe as an example, the image on the left here shows the potential CO2 distribution for our maximum capacity case, showing how the CO2 will essentially spread out and occupy the entire structure. The waterfall chart on the right of the slide shows a number of factors that may then impact the effective storage capacity. So just as a note, the base of the y-axis isn't at 0 here. This is just to give a kind of zoomed in view at what might impact the capacity. And the factors range from things that we have a level of control over, such as the impurities in the injection stream, to subsurface processes that have essentially already happened, such as water influx into the reservoir. One of the key characteristics of the Morecambe reservoirs that has enabled them to be such prolific producers over the past few decades is the relatively low impact of water influx into the fields, which has been very good news for production, but also allows for high storage efficiencies when looking at CO2 storage, as the majority of the pore space is still highly gas saturated. So far, our modeling suggests storage efficiency is upwards of 85%, which compared to other depleted gas fields is quite high for the reasons I've mentioned. And towards the right-hand side of the waterfall, you can see one of the biggest remaining unknowns for CO2 storage in depleted gas fields, which is injectivity, which I'll go into a bit more detail about in a few slides' time. So integrity is obviously a key part of any carbon store. We need to have confidence that any carbon dioxide that we inject into the store is going to stay there. I've split integrity into two parts here. So the first aspect is the geological or the seal integrity. And the seal over the Morecambe storage complex is a really good one. It's composed of thick interbedded mudstone and halite sequences. And the immediate caprock for the reservoirs is the filed halite member. A halite seal has been shown to be highly important for seal integrity in other carbon stores due to the extremely low permeability and also the ductile nature of halite. This lithology is a proven sealing lithology capable of supporting large gas columns. So the South Morecambe field had a 500-meter gas column. And an important detail to note is that these structures have trapped naturally occurring CO2 and smaller molecules like helium over geological time. So the North Morecambe gas contains around 6% of CO2, while the real field to the north, which is a close analog, contains 37% CO2. Geomechanical modeling of the depressurization and then repressurization of these fields indicates that the risk of fault reactivation or weakening of the caprock over the production and injection life cycle is extremely low. So the second aspect to integrity is well integrity, which Rodrigo is probably going to go into much more detail about in his presentation. But this is of particular focus on depleted gas fields due to the number of existing well penetrations in the structures. And it's often highlighted as the biggest potential risk for carbon storage in depleted gas fields. So across the two Morecambe fields, we have 12 exploration and appraisal wells, which were all abandoned in the 1970s and 80s, and a total of 46 development wells, 12 of which have been abandoned within the past 5 years to enable platform decommissioning. But all of these wells have complete well records thanks to the historical continuity of ownership of the hub. The E&A wells have been the focus of a couple of recent studies to assess the risk levels of those wells, given that they were abandoned several decades ago. And the studies have found that the vast majority of these wells are low risk and the barriers are compliant with current OE UK abandonment guidelines. An additional quantitative study was carried out, which found that the chance of any significant leak paths in all 12 of these E&A wells was considered in that study to be extremely low, so less than 1 in 10,000. The reuse of existing development wells has been evaluated, so they're going to be considered for use as monitoring wells. However, new platforms and new wells are being planned for the CO2 injection phase of the project. Nonetheless, all of the wells that are in the structure remain an area of high focus, and there are numerous further studies planned to minimize risks wherever possible. So moving on to injectivity, the most obvious place to start when looking at the injectivity of an existing gas field is the productivity of that field. And the reservoir quality of the Morecambe fields is largely very good. There are high quality zones correlatable across both fields with average porosities of 13% and average permeabilities of 200 millidarcies. And these provide, sorry, I'm getting a bit of feedback from someone. Seems to have gone. And these provide the majority of productivity in the wells. The heterogeneity of reservoir quality within each field is well understood thanks to the number of well penetrations, with a significant amount of petrophysical log and core data available. The image on the right shows an example of this data with high permeabilities and relatively low shale content observed in all of the wells. Each field is also internally well connected with no observable compartmentalization during the production timeframe. So essentially the two fields are very large tanks. And from the past few decades of production, we know that the reservoir is highly productive with significant connected volumes associated with each well. So assuming that this base productivity can translate to injectivity, the reservoir modeling suggests that the South Morecambe reservoir can handle injection rates of up to 30 million tonnes per annum, with the North Morecambe reservoir providing an additional 10 million tonnes per annum. For reference, the UK net zero carbon storage target is 50 million tonnes per annum by 2035. So if we were able to achieve these rates, the MNZ cluster would be providing 80% of that target. The big question, of course, is how does that hydrocarbon productivity translate to CO2 injectivity, particularly in the world of these very heavily depleted reservoirs? So given that we know we have good productivity, where does the uncertainty around CO2 injectivity come from? And a lot of this uncertainty is related to the impact of Joule-Thomson cooling, which is cooling caused by gas expansion. This effect will be most severe in the near wellbore region when injecting from an area of higher pressure in the well to lower pressure in the reservoir. And carbon dioxide itself has a relatively high Joule-Thomson coefficient, particularly at these low pressures, which means it has a higher cooling effect than other gases, and it'll be very important to manage early injection conditions and rates very closely. I should mention that given the low pressure of these fields as they are, the intention is to inject in gas phase initially, with the potential for converting into dense phase injection when reaching the critical pressure of carbon dioxide. The potential consequences of Joule-Thomson cooling are things such as hydrate formation or ice formation, which would reduce injectivity and may require remediation. Thermally induced fracturing is also a possibility, so that would potentially increase the injectivity, but has other implications around integrity of the cap rock, integrity of your wells, and also control of the injection rates. And then other effects such as formation damage during drilling into such depleted reservoirs, as well as chemical reactions of CO2 with the formation, need to be further assessed and understood. As this area remains one of the biggest subsurface uncertainties for this project, Spirit Energy are commencing an extensive well injectivity study as part of our license commitments to gain a better understanding of potential risks and allow for mitigation measures to be developed in advance of full development. And we're also actively participating in a number of joint industry projects to further understand the complexities of this relatively new area. So that's a quick overview of how the Morecambe carbon stores match up against the three principal requirements of capacity, integrity, and injectivity, which were identified by the EU CCS directive. The stores have significant potential capacity with theoretical capacity of slightly over 1 gigaton, and modeling work's ongoing to determine how this translates to effective storage capacity, but we believe we can achieve storage efficiencies upwards of 85%. The integrity of the stores is robust, and the structures have proven that they're capable of trapping both hydrocarbons and carbon dioxide over geological timeframes, and our existing well integrity is well understood and being continually assessed to minimize risks wherever possible. On injectivity, historically, these reservoirs have been extremely productive. Initial injection rates of up to 10 million tons per annum for each field are planned, and assuming we can address and manage the challenges associated with injectivity, the two fields combined could handle up to 40 million tons per annum of CO2 injection. And thanks to the long history of this asset as a prolific gas producer, as well as Spirit Energy being the sole owner of the lifetime of the hub, we have a significant quantity of existing data to characterize the reservoirs, and we'll be acquiring additional data where appropriate to maximize the potential of the cluster. And I'll finish on a slide just reiterating the potential of the cluster as a whole. So centered around the carbon stores that I've described with significant capacity and well-suited geology for storage, this project intends to offer a large-scale emissions abatement solution for emitters both in the peak cluster and elsewhere in the region by 2030. A range of potential transport options will provide diversity and flexibility, with existing production infrastructure able to be reused and repurposed for carbon storage. And the project will help the UK on the road to net zero, while also protecting and creating both regional and national jobs, as well as attracting further investment to the area. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for listening. I think I'm going to be passing directly over to Rodrigo, and then we're going to do questions in a combined session after that. So yeah, thanks for that.
Thank you, Tom. Rodrigo, are you ready to share?
Yeah.
That was great, Tom. You got lots of questions already coming in. You can have a little look at those.
I'm scared to open the chat.
There we go. Thanks, Rodrigo.
Yeah, so hopefully people can see my screen. Yeah,
Yep.
I'll take that. Excellent. Thanks everyone for joining, and thanks to SP for the invite. I'm Rodrigo Oropeza. I work for Storegga. I'm the wells lead for Storegga, and I've been working for CCS here in the UK for 4 years already. So I've been involved in different projects, mainly within the Acorn project, overlooking at part of the new CO2 injection well design, and similarly, one of the key aspects that Tom already discussed is the well integrity assessment, not only for new wells and assuring that CO2 will be injected safely and securely, but also on the legacy well integrity assessment and how to